Thanks to At Home for joining us this hour. They sent him and his wife dead rats in the mail. This is from the resentencing filing that his lawyers ultimately made on his behalf. Quote, Mr. Arbel was indeed threatened. He and his wife received a number of dead rats on various occasions in the mail. He was treated as a target as much as a co-conspirator, perhaps because he was an outsider and a foreigner. He was used and extorted. This is a guy who had pled guilty to his involvement in a criminal scheme, pled guilty, agreed to help prosecutors against the other people who had been charged as defendants in that scheme. Their response was to come after him, including by mailing dead rats to him and his family, which is not a subtle thing. Hard to miss that message. Even years later, when he was appealing to the court to lessen his own sentence in that case, he said years later that he was still afraid to make public some of the other threats that had been made against him and his wife and his child. Beyond the dead rats, there was more, but he would only address those on a confidential basis for the court. He was trying to make the case to the court that he deserved more credit, basically, for flipping against these particular co-defendants. Given the kind of risk that he and his family took on to do that, he was asking the court to essentially give him more credit for that. And there was corroboration for his claims about how big a risk he was taking, including not just the stuff about the dead rats in the mail, but also his co-defendant, who was, quote, severely beaten by some of the other gentlemen involved in this crime. What this crime was a pump and dump stock scheme connected to the mob. And it was a big one. According to the indictment in the case, which was filed in the Eastern District of New York, the scheme produced tens of millions of dollars in illegal profits. Quote, although Euro Atlantic held itself out as a legitimate brokerage firm, it was in fact operated for the primary purpose of earning money through fraud. As laid out by federal prosecutors in this case, the basic way it worked was that there was this firm, Euro Atlantic, that was set up in Florida, and that firm secretly owned big blocks of totally worthless stocks in what were essentially made-up worthless companies. But then, in conjunction with the mob, with the Colombo crime family, to be specific, that firm in Florida basically set up a New York outpost. They set up basically a boiler room in New York. And the mobsters and the crooks who worked at that boiler room were assigned to artificially drive up demand for these worthless stocks by a variety of illegal and very mob-like means, basically forcing people to buy these stocks, tricking people into it, conning people into it, intimidating people into it. When people caught into the scheme and told them they wanted to sell those stocks, they didn't want them after all. They just wouldn't allow them to sell them. There were beatings, there was intimidation. But when those stocks were ultimately bought up, thanks to the work of that mobbed-up boiler room, that, of course, would make the demand for the stock go up. That would make the price of those stocks go up. And then this firm in Florida, that was the heart of the scheme, Euro Atlantic, once the price of those stocks was up, they would sell all of their shares at that higher price. They'd get all the money, they'd cash out, then the price of the stocks would collapse. So the mobsters make off with tons of money. All the suckers who got strong-armed or tricked or intimidated into buying all this worthless stuff to pump up the price of those stocks, those are all the people that got soaked. And I know it sounds like kind of a white-collar thing. I confess I have no idea what color shirts these guys wore or if they wore shirts at all. But this is not necessarily the kind of thing you might picture when you imagine like white-collar Wall Street crime. I mean, for example, this one really did involve giant bags of cash money. Quote, the defendants, together with others, laundered money by wiring profits from the fraudulent scheme to Citi check cashing in New Jersey. After the profits were wired to Citi check cashing, defendant Stephen DeBenedetto and others went to Citi check's office and obtained cash in the amount of the wire transfers. The cash proceeds were used in part to make cash payoffs and bribes for selling the stocks that were implicated in this scheme. And just in case we're not totally clear on what that means, like cinematically, they're getting cash for the amount of the wire transfers. That literally means they're getting bags of cash that they're taking out of this check cashing place in New Jersey, this check cashing place that's part of their money laundering scheme. And if you want to imagine the size of the bags of cash that they're taking out of there, look at the amounts as spelled out in the indictment. On September 21st, it was $45,000. On October 11th, it was $83,300. November 7th, it was $468,200. Put that all in the bag, please. January 14th, $166,000. Look at this. Over the course of just 1 week in October, these are transfers that they did in and out of that check cashing place. $800,000 in cash on a Thursday. The following Tuesday, they pick up another $188,000. The following day, on the Wednesday, another $136,000 large. All in cash. Gigantic bags of money that they're presumably throwing in the trunk of some mobster car and driving off with in New Jersey to go pay off the various crooks involved in this scheme, and presumably to have, like, you know, Carmela hide it in the crawl space with the AK-47s and the gold bars. I mean, another way you know this was not your typical white-collar crime was the list of guys named in the indictment, alongside their co-defendant who flipped, to whom they sent the dead rats. You had name-checked guys like Colombo crime family members, Black Dom and Wild Bill. Wild Bill also went by the very tabloid-friendly name of Billy Fingers. Within a couple of years of this mafia stock scheme firm being shut down and expelled from the U.S. securities industry for its crimes, Wild Bill, a.k.a. Billy Fingers, who's described in the indictment as a captain in the Colombo organized crime family, he would soon be murdered in a basement in Brooklyn. They would not find his body until 9 years later in a mob dumping ground outside the All-County Flooring Supply Store in Long Island, New York. By then, his family had gone into witness protection. Authorities were able to identify his body officially by his dental records, but contemporaneous reporting suggests that all of his missing fingers helped with the identification, too, even after he was wrapped up in a tarp and stuffed under a flooring supply store parking lot for 9 years. So, yeah, this was not exactly your typical Wall Street crime spree. But it was the end of Euro Atlantic Securities Incorporated. They were expelled formally from the U.S. securities industry. They left a regulatory trail that doesn't tell you all that much about what exactly went wrong there. But when you check the criminal indictments and ultimately the trail of murders of the people involved, that gives you all the detail you might want and more. Euro Atlantic Securities Incorporated. That was their story. You want to know who worked at Euro Atlantic Securities Incorporated? This guy did. Lev Parnas, arrested earlier this month in the criminal trial that is unfolding in parallel alongside the presidential impeachment inquiry in Washington. CNN reporting today that since his arraignment last week in federal district court in Manhattan, Lev Parnas is under house arrest in Florida. Today, we learned that in addition to the criminal case proceedings pending against him in New York, Mr. Parnas has also been ordered by a different federal judge in Florida that he needs to testify under oath in a federal civil case against him. It's a court order from 2016 that ordered him to repay more than $500,000 that he took from a family trust. Despite that court order, he didn't repay the money. That's why he's being pursued in federal court now by the people who he stole this money from. Among other things, they've been following his own money trail and his own assets to try to get their $500,000 back. Well, today, a federal judge ruled in that case that Lev Parnas has to appear in court to give sworn testimony about his financial situation and his assets, including specifically about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he was somehow able to scratch together to pay the National Republican Campaign Committee and various Republican politicians and the super PAC supporting President Trump's reelection. According to this federal judge's order today in Florida, Lev Parnas needs to give that sworn testimony within 30 days, which means he will have to fit it in around the criminal case that he's facing in a different federal jurisdiction up north for allegedly funneling illegal foreign campaign donations to Republican candidates and to the president's reelection PAC. It's an illegal donation scheme that prosecutors say was tied to an effort by Mr. Parnas and his co-defendant to get the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine fired. She, of course, was fired. She recently testified in the president's impeachment inquiry in a way that gave us a good sense as to why these guys might have wanted her fired, might have wanted her out of that embassy in Ukraine. But given the links between this ongoing criminal case and the ongoing and increasingly serious impeachment proceedings against the president in Washington, it's interesting to look at them both at once. I mean, it's interesting. This guy, you go back to his time at the dead rats in the mail mafia stock shop. I mean, we know from his publicly accessible records from his own time as a broker that he was there at Euro Atlantic at the time of the crimes for which these defendants were all charged. And Lev Parnas himself was not indicted when his whole company was brought down in this mafia indictment and then expelled from the securities industry, shut down by the federal government for its crimes. He personally was not indicted, but he was working there at the time the crimes happened. And once that firm was shut down on order from the feds, he had to find another place to work. Next place he went was another brokerage firm where he went for less than a year. Then he hopped to another brokerage firm for less than 3 months. The next place he landed thereafter was another firm that also got expelled from the securities industry, that also got forcibly shut down by federal regulators for committing financial crimes. Lev Parnas was listed as the director and president of that firm, which got shut down by regulators, got kicked out of Wall Street. After that one got shut down, the next place he landed was also expelled from the securities industry and shut down by federal regulators for committing crimes. It's like this stuff just really trailed him around. Imagine the bad luck. Every place he worked got shut down as a criminal enterprise, including all the mob stuff. It's weird, right? It's just uncanny. After the third straight firm that he worked at got shut down and expelled from the U.S. securities industry, Lev Parnas finally appears to have given up his work in finance. Of course, we know that he lands on his feet because now he works for the President of the United States of America. At least he was. We're not sure if that continues now while he's under arrest and awaiting trial. But this is just a remarkable thing that is plodding along alongside what is happening on Capitol Hill with all the impeachment drama. I mean, there's this guy who is under arrest. He's facing more than 30 years in prison. He's charged with funneling illegal foreign money to the president's reelection effort and other Republican campaigns. There are enough pictures of him with the president and the president's eldest son and the president's lawyer. I mean, there's enough pictures of this guy with the president and the president's milieu that you could make a deck of cards out of these photos. When this guy was first directed to appear before the impeachment proceedings against President Trump, he engaged one of President Trump's Russia lawyers initially to handle his defense. That lawyer, John Dowd, you see on the right there, then notified Congress in writing that his client, Lev Parnas, wasn't just any witness they could call in to testify about anything. He was a special guy. They were not going to be able to get anything out of him because he, Mr. Parnas, according to his lawyer, John Dowd, quote, assists Rudy Giuliani in connection with Mr. Giuliani's representation of President Trump. So the president has a lawyer. His name is Rudy Giuliani. In Rudy Giuliani's capacity as the president's lawyer, he employs this guy, Lev Parnas, as his assistant, as his little helper, which seemed crazy, not least because John Dowd, that lawyer, wrote his letter about this to Congress in the Comic Sans typeface, which made it seem like it was maybe a joke. But then, sure enough, when Mr. Parnas got arraigned in court along with his co-defendants in federal court in New York, a different lawyer of his representing him in court made the case out loud to the federal judge in that federal courtroom that Lev Parnas's case was going to implicate executive privilege concerns because, in fact, this criminal case against Mr. Parnas does overlap with the legal representation of the President of the United States because, in fact, Lev Parnas is part of the president's legal team. This guy who is under arrest, the guy with the dead rat in the mail mob stock scheme before all the other stock schemes he was associated with that also got shut down by federal regulators. I mean, this thing that the president is being impeached for, Mr. Parnas does seem to have been a very diligent worker, a very central part of that scheme. He was making what prosecutors say were illegal donations to Republican campaigns. And then for at least one of those Republican members of Congress to whom he gave illegal donations, he took a meeting with that member of Congress to advocate that that member of Congress try to get the ambassador to Ukraine fired. And that member of Congress went ahead and tried to get the ambassador to Ukraine fired. Again, we know from that ambassador's testimony in the impeachment proceedings that you can imagine why they might have wanted her fired, that she was in the way of this scheme the president cooked up to try to get Ukraine to give him help against his domestic political enemies and to withhold their military aid and things like White House meetings until they did so. She was in the way of that. So, yeah, she had to go. I mean, in that part of the scheme for which the president is now being impeached, it appears that good old Lev Parnas played a key role in trying to organize the ousting of that Ukraine ambassador. In the end, that effort was successful. Mr. Parnas was also, we now know, involved in setting up interviews on the Fox News channel to help sell this idea that Ukraine could provide important information that would somehow look terrible for the Democratic Party and Vice President Joe Biden. We know he was also involved in setting up interviews for and providing materials to this guy, who until recently worked at the Hill newspaper in Washington. He's no longer there, but he has, throughout this scandal, continued writing most of the script for what President Trump has been trying to gin up in Ukraine to use against the Democratic Party. Lev Parnas was involved in all of that. I mean, Mr. Parnas has been doing all of that work on this scheme for which the president is being impeached. And while that's been going on, lawyers for this indicted Ukrainian oligarch, who prosecutors say is a top figure in Russian organized crime, he has longtime links to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. He's currently under indictment in this country, fighting extradition, so he won't have to go on trial here in a huge international corruption and bribery case. His new lawyers, as he fights extradition, now say that Lev Parnas is also part of his legal team. Lev Parnas has been working for them as they represent Putin-connected Ukrainian oligarch Dmitry Firtash. So there's this criminal case, right? Sort of in parallel and alongside the impeachment proceedings in Capitol Hill. But think about what this one guy represents in those two stories, right? I mean, simultaneously, as the president is being impeached, this guy is part of the legal team representing both the Russian organized crime guy under indictment and, at the same time, what's the phrase from John Dowd's note? He is also, quote, assisting Mr. Giuliani in connection with his representation of President Trump. I mean, pick a scandal. Pick any scandal in American political history. A president facing impeachment about some scheme he's tried to cook up with some other country to help him in the next election. I mean, what other president could you ever even imagine being up to his neck with this guy who is part of the president's legal team while he is under arrest? And also while he is part of the legal team for a Russian organized crime figure who's under indictment and fighting extradition to this country. He's on both legal teams simultaneously. And I will also just note the claim about Mr. Parnas being part of the president's legal team, right? The claim there is that Mr. Parnas is working for Giuliani, right? Lev Parnas is assisting Mr. Giuliani in connection with his representation of President Trump. Okay, well, if you're assisting somebody, that implies you are working for somebody. This implies he's working for Giuliani. When you work for someone, that implies that the person you're working for pays you, right, to work for them? Well, for some reason in this case, that relationship is backwards. There's no evidence whatsoever that Rudy Giuliani is paying this guy who is assisting him in the representation of President Trump. Instead, it appears that this guy is paying Rudy. Giuliani admits that he's received $500,000 from Parnas's firm. Where did Parnas's firm get the money? As the Washington Post now reports, it's not totally clear why Mr. Parnas was paying Giuliani for the privilege of helping him, nor where he was getting the money to do so. The Washington Post quotes Lev Parnas saying to someone late last year, quote, "Can you loan me $500K so I can get Rudy off my back?" You pay him $500,000 so that you can work as his assistant in his legal representation of the president? Huh? Who's actually paying Rudy for the work that he's doing on behalf of the president? We know the president isn't paying him. He says he's doing it pro bono. But his assistant is paying him $500,000? And we don't know where that money came from? And he's now under arrest and is charged with funneling foreign money illegally to Republican causes? I mean, that's the soup we're now in. That is Team Trump here in the scheme for which the president is being impeached. And so naturally, the president and his supporters have declared today that this guy is the real scandal here. That this guy is the guy who everybody should be, what, ashamed to be associated with?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.